March 15, 1945. Würzburg, Bavaria. The morning air hung thick with the acrid smell of smoke and pulverized stone. Shafts of pale sunlight pierced through the skeletal remains of what had once been the magnificent St. Kilian Cathedral, its Gothic spires now reduced to jagged teeth against a colorless sky. In the rubble-strewn square below, an elderly German woman knelt among the scattered stones, her weathered hands trembling as she clutched a small wooden crucifix, one of the few sacred objects to survive the inferno that had consumed her city just weeks before. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant rumble of American tanks rolling through the devastated streets and the soft weeping of those who had lost everything they held sacred. This moment in the ruins of Würzburg represented far more than the aftermath of another Allied bombing raid. It marked the beginning of an extraordinary transformation that would challenge everything both conqueror and conquered believed about their enemies, their faith, and the very nature of human compassion in the darkest hours of war. For 6 years, Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as godless materialists, cultural barbarians incapable of understanding the deep spiritual traditions that had shaped European civilization for over a millennium. Meanwhile, American soldiers had been told they were liberating a continent from fanatics who had abandoned all moral decency in pursuit of their twisted ideology. Neither side could have imagined that in the smoking ruins of Bavaria's churches, these fundamental assumptions would crumble as surely as the ancient stones that lay scattered in the spring rain. The Cathedral of St. Kilian had stood for 700 years, a testament to the enduring power of faith and the masterful craftsmanship of medieval stoneworkers whose names had been forgotten long before the first American soldier ever set foot on European soil. Its soaring nave had witnessed the prayers of countless generations, peasants and princes, merchants and mystics, all seeking solace beneath its ribbed vaults and stained glass windows that transformed ordinary sunlight into something approaching the divine. When the Royal Air Force bombers appeared over Würzburg on that terrible night of March 16, 1945, they carried with them not just high explosives and incendiary devices, but the power to erase centuries of accumulated memory, devotion, and artistic achievement in a matter of minutes. The strategic rationale for the bombing was clear enough to Allied commanders, studying their maps and intelligence reports from safe headquarters hundreds of miles away. Würzburg served as a crucial transportation hub for German forces retreating from the collapsing Eastern Front, and its marshalling yards had been funneling reinforcements and supplies to Wehrmacht units struggling to maintain defensive positions along the Rhine. The ancient city's narrow medieval streets concealed workshops that had been converted to produce components for V-2 rockets, and its university had been conscripted into research programs supporting the Nazi war effort. From a purely military perspective, Würzburg was a legitimate target, another tactical objective to be neutralized, in the methodical dismantling of the Third Reich's capacity to continue fighting. But the men of the 12th Armored Division who entered the smoldering city 3 weeks later encountered something that no amount of military training or ideological preparation could have equipped them to handle. Staff Sergeant Robert Mackenzie, a 24-year-old machinist's son from Pittsburgh, wrote in a letter to his wife that the destruction was beyond anything I ever imagined possible. The entire medieval core of the city had been reduced to a moonscape of rubble and twisted metal, with only the charred shells of the most substantial stone buildings remaining to hint at what had once stood there. "It looks like the end of the world," Mackenzie wrote, like God himself got angry and decided to start over from scratch. Among the American troops moving through these ruins, there was an unspoken expectation that they would encounter the typical aftermath of urban warfare, perhaps some scattered resistance from fanatic holdouts, certainly the logistical challenges of securing a destroyed city and establishing military administration over a defeated population. What they found instead was something far more complex and emotionally challenging. A community of survivors who had lost not just their homes and livelihoods, but the very physical manifestation of their spiritual identity, the sacred spaces that had anchored their understanding of meaning and continuity across generations of upheaval and change. The reactions of individual American soldiers to this scene of devastation revealed the profound gap between official, military doctrine and the human reality of conquest. Private James Kowalski, whose Polish grandparents had fled European persecution to find sanctuary in Chicago's immigrant neighborhoods, found himself unexpectedly moved by the sight of elderly German women sorting through rubble with their bare hands, searching for any fragment of religious artwork or sacred vessels that might have survived the bombing. "These could be my own babcia," he confided to his squad leader, using the Polish word for grandmother that his family had maintained through 3 generations in America. "They're just old ladies trying to find their Jesus." This empathetic response was by no means universal among the American forces. Many soldiers, particularly those who had witnessed the horrors of Nazi concentration camps or lost friends to German resistance during the long advance through France and into the Reich itself, felt little sympathy for any aspect of German suffering. Corporal William Bradley, whose unit had helped liberate Dachau just months earlier, expressed the harder perspective that dominated official policy. "They started this war. They cheered for Hitler, and now they want us to feel sorry for them because their churches got bombed. Where was their Christianity when they were loading Jews into cattle cars?" Yet even among the most hardened veterans, the specific site of religious destruction seemed to touch something deeper than political calculation or military pragmatism. The United States Army of 1945 was still predominantly Christian in both composition and cultural identity, drawing heavily from rural and small-town communities where church attendance remained a central pillar of social life. Many of these soldiers had grown up in traditions that taught them to revere sacred spaces, regardless of denominational differences, and the sight of desecrated altars and shattered crosses created an uncomfortable cognitive dissonance that purely secular destruction could not produce. Father Thomas Murphy, a Catholic chaplain attached to the 12th Armored Division, found himself confronting this tension daily as he conducted services for American troops in whatever intact buildings could be requisitioned for religious purposes. "The men are struggling with what they see," he noted in his official reports to division headquarters. "They understand that war requires terrible choices, but they're having trouble reconciling their Christian upbringing with the deliberate destruction of houses of worship. Some are asking if we've crossed a line that soldiers shouldn't cross." It was against this backdrop of moral uncertainty and practical necessity that an extraordinary initiative began to take shape. The idea did not originate from high-level policy directives or carefully crafted psychological warfare programs, but rather from the spontaneous actions of individual soldiers who found themselves unable to walk past the ruins of St. Kilian Cathedral without feeling compelled to do something more than simply establish military control over the area. Sergeant Mackenzie, despite having no formal training in construction or architecture, began spending his off-duty hours examining the fallen stones and trying to understand how the medieval builders had fit them together into such soaring structures. "I keep thinking about the guys who built this place," Mackenzie wrote to his wife in May 1945. "They didn't have cranes or power tools or any of the equipment we take for granted back home. They just had their hands and their faith, and somehow they made something that lasted 700 years until we came along and knocked it down in one night. Maybe we owe it to them, and to ourselves, to see if we can put at least some of it back together." This sentiment found unexpected support from Captain William Harrison, a regular Army officer who had studied medieval history at Yale before the war and possessed enough knowledge of Gothic architecture to appreciate the mathematical precision and artistic achievement represented by the cathedral's surviving fragments. Harrison faced a complex command decision. His primary responsibility was maintaining security and preparing his unit for potential redeployment to the Pacific Theater. But he also recognized that the psychological and political benefits of demonstrating American magnanimity toward the German cultural heritage could serve broader strategic objectives in the emerging post-war environment. The German civilian population's initial reaction to American interest in the cathedral's restoration was a mixture of suspicion, desperate hope, and profound confusion. For 12 years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as crass materialists who valued nothing beyond immediate profit and physical comfort, incapable of understanding or appreciating the deeper cultural and spiritual traditions that supposedly defined European civilization. The notion that these same Americans might voluntarily commit time and resources to rebuilding a German church challenged fundamental assumptions about both the nature of their conquerors and the validity of everything they had been taught about the character of democratic societies. Elizabeth Miller, a 63-year-old seamstress whose family had worshipped at St. Kilian for 4 generations, initially refused to believe that the American soldiers examining the ruins were genuinely interested in reconstruction, rather than simply cataloging valuable materials for shipment back to the United States. "Why would they care about our church?" she asked her neighbor, Maria Schmidt, as they watched Sergeant Mackenzie and several other soldiers carefully measuring and photographing the fallen stones. "They have their own churches in America. What does our God mean to them?" This question touched upon one of the most profound ideological challenges faced by both Germans and Americans as they encountered each other not as abstract enemies but as individual human beings sharing the same devastated landscape. The Nazi worldview had insisted that democratic societies were inherently rootless and superficial, lacking the deep spiritual connections to blood, soil, and tradition that supposedly gave meaning to German existence. Americans, according to this narrative, were motivated solely by material self-interest, and could never comprehend the mystical bonds that united true believers in a transcendent cause. The reality that German civilians discovered as they began cautiously interacting with their American occupiers proved far more complex and troubling to their preconceived notions. Many of the soldiers showed not only respect for religious traditions, but active knowledge of Christian theology and history that often exceeded that of the Germans themselves. Corporal David Steinberg, a Jewish soldier from Brooklyn whose grandparents had fled pogroms in Eastern Europe, surprised local residents by his ability to read Latin inscriptions on damaged tombstones and explain the symbolism embedded in various architectural details of the cathedral. "The American soldiers know more about our own church than we do," admitted Father Heinrich Weber, the elderly priest who had served St. Kilian Parish for over 30 years before the bombing forced him to conduct services in a requisitioned warehouse on the outskirts of town. "They ask questions about the medieval construction techniques, about the meaning of different architectural elements, about the history of our community that I struggle to answer. It makes me wonder what else we have been wrong about." The gradual development of cooperation between American soldiers and German civilians around the cathedral restoration project created a unique laboratory for testing the fundamental assumptions that had driven both sides throughout the war. Nazi ideology had insisted that democratic societies were too individualistic and self-centered to sustain the collective sacrifice necessary for great achievements, while American wartime propaganda had portrayed Germans as either fanatical automatons incapable of independent moral reasoning or cowards who supported evil only as long as it remained profitable and safe. The daily reality of working together to move massive stones, sort through rubble for salvageable materials, and attempt to decipher the intentions of long-dead master builders gradually eroded these simplified characterizations on both sides. American soldiers discovered that many German civilians had never been enthusiastic supporters of the Nazi regime, but had simply tried to survive in impossible circumstances, while Germans learned that Americans were capable of both deep cultural sophistication and genuine altruistic concern for people they had been taught to consider their enemies. The symbolic power of this collaboration centered around a particular object that had survived the bombing in damaged but recognizable condition, a carved wooden crucifix that had originally adorned the cathedral's main altar. The cross itself was a masterpiece of late Gothic woodcarving, created by an unknown artist sometime in the 15th century and depicting Christ's suffering with a combination of realistic detail and spiritual transcendence that represented the highest achievements of medieval religious art. The bombing had cracked the wooden figure and scattered fragments of its decorative elements throughout the rubble, but the central image remained intact enough to be recognizably divine. For the German survivors, this crucifix represented far more than an art object or even a religious symbol. It embodied the continuity of their community's spiritual life across centuries of war, plague, political upheaval, and social transformation. Children had been baptized beneath its watchful gaze. Couples had exchanged marriage vows in its presence, and countless generations of believers had sought comfort in its promise of redemption through suffering. The fact that it had survived the bombing while so much else had been destroyed seemed to many locals like a sign of divine providence, an indication that their faith itself could endure even the most devastating trials. When Sergeant Mackenzie volunteered to lead the delicate work of extracting the crucifix from the rubble and attempting to restore it to displayable condition, he unknowingly assumed responsibility for something that transcended his mechanical skills or good intentions. The project required not only careful craftsmanship, but also cultural sensitivity and theological understanding that challenged his Presbyterian upbringing from industrial Pittsburgh. Working with hand tools requisitioned from the division's engineering corps, Mackenzie spent dozens of hours painstakingly cleaning centuries of accumulated soot and recent bomb damage from the carved wooden surface, gradually revealing details and expressions that had been obscured for decades. The process of restoration became a daily gathering point for both American soldiers and German civilians, creating an informal space for conversation and mutual observation that transcended the official boundaries between occupier and occupied. Private Kowalski, drawing upon skills learned in his father's carpentry workshop, contributed expertise in wood preservation and repair techniques, while local residents offered knowledge of traditional German craftsmanship methods and access to materials that might be suitable for restoration work. As the crucifix slowly regained its original appearance under this collaborative effort, it began to function as a powerful symbol of possibilities that neither American nor German participants had originally imagined. For the soldiers, the project represented proof that their country's values included not just military might and material prosperity but also respect for cultural heritage and willingness to help former enemies rebuild their lives with dignity. For the German civilians, American commitment to restoring their most sacred symbol suggested that democratic societies might possess depths of spiritual understanding and moral commitment that Nazi propaganda had systematically denied. The emotional impact of this symbolism reached its climax on a rain-soaked morning in early June 1945, when the restored crucifix was finally ready to be returned to its place of honor in the partially reconstructed sanctuary. Captain Harrison had arranged for the ceremony to be conducted jointly by Father Weber and Chaplain Murphy, representing both the local German community and the American forces who had made the restoration possible. Nearly 100 people gathered in the ruins of the cathedral, Germans and Americans standing side by side, among the fallen stones and makeshift wooden scaffolding that supported the partially rebuilt altar, the sight of elderly German women weeping openly as they witnessed American soldiers carefully lifting the restored crucifix into position created a moment of profound emotional breakthrough that transcended all the political and military calculations that had brought these two groups into contact. These were not tears of gratitude or submission, but rather expressions of something far more complex and transformative. The recognition that human beings who had been systematically taught to hate and fear each other were capable of finding common ground in their shared reverence for beauty, craftsmanship, and the eternal questions that had always driven people to create sacred spaces. Maria Schmidt, whose son had been killed fighting American forces in Normandy just months earlier, found herself standing next to Corporal Bradley, who had lost his best friend to German artillery during the Battle of the Bulge. Neither spoke the other's language well enough for complex conversation, but both understood perfectly the significance of what they were witnessing. The possibility that even the most bitter conflicts could give way to mutual recognition of shared humanity when people encountered each other as individuals rather than representatives of abstract ideologies. The restoration project's success encouraged similar initiatives throughout the American-occupied zone, as word spread through military channels about the positive response generated by combining practical reconstruction assistance with respect for local cultural traditions. Division headquarters began receiving reports from other units describing how cooperation on church restoration projects was improving relations with civilian populations and reducing the security problems that typically plagued military occupation forces. But the deeper significance of what had happened in Würzburg extended far beyond its immediate tactical benefits for American military administration. The cathedral restoration had created a space where fundamental assumptions about democracy, Christianity, and national character could be tested against actual experience, rather than ideological preconceptions. German civilians who had been taught that democratic societies were inherently shallow and materialistic discovered Americans who possessed both technical competence and spiritual depth, while American soldiers who had been conditioned to view Germans as either fanatics or cowards found individuals capable of both independent, moral reasoning and profound devotion to transcendent values. The theological implications of this encounter proved particularly challenging for participants on both sides. American Protestant soldiers working alongside German Catholics and Lutherans to restore a medieval cathedral necessarily confronted questions about the relationship between different Christian traditions and the possibility that denominational differences might be less important than shared commitment to core spiritual principles. For German believers who had lived through 12 years of Nazi attempts to subordinate Christianity to political ideology, the sight of Americans treating their religious heritage with genuine respect suggested that secular democratic governments might actually provide better protection for religious freedom than regimes that claim to embody sacred nationalist traditions. Father Weber, whose own faith had been severely tested by the moral compromises required to maintain his ministry under Nazi rule, found himself profoundly moved by conversations with Chaplain Murphy about the role of religious institutions in democratic societies. In America, Murphy explained during one of their evening discussions in the partially restored rectory, we believe that faith is strongest when it remains free from political control, when believers can follow their consciences without fear of government interference. The separation of church and state that your leaders have always criticized actually protects religion from the kind of corruption that occurs when political powers try to use God for their own purposes. This perspective challenged Weber's understanding of the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority in ways that extended far beyond theological abstractions. Throughout his ministry, he had struggled with the tension between his pastoral responsibilities to his congregation and the political pressures imposed by a regime that demanded religious institutions serve state ideology. The American model suggested an alternative arrangement where churches could maintain their independence and prophetic voice precisely because they remained outside the direct control of political authorities. As summer turned to autumn in 1945, the Cathedral Restoration Project evolved from an emergency humanitarian gesture into something approaching a systematic program of cultural reconstruction. Engineers from the division's construction battalions began providing technical assistance for more complex structural repairs, while specialists in medieval architecture were occasionally brought in from universities in the United States to advise on historically accurate restoration techniques. The project attracted attention from journalists and photographers documenting the American occupation, and images of German and American hands working together to rebuild sacred spaces began appearing in newspapers and magazines back home. The symbolic power of these images resonated deeply with American audiences who were struggling to understand their country's new role as a global superpower with unprecedented responsibilities for shaping the post-war world. The cathedral restoration seemed to embody the highest aspirations of American foreign policy. The belief that military victory could be followed by generous assistance in rebuilding defeated enemies as peaceful democratic partners. Here was visible proof that American values included not just material prosperity and individual freedom but also respect for cultural heritage and willingness to help others preserve what they cherished most deeply. For German observers, both local participants and those who learned about the project through word of mouth and underground newspapers, the American commitment to restoring religious architecture carried equally profound symbolic weight. If these conquerors could show such respect for German cultural and spiritual traditions, perhaps the future under democratic occupation would not require the complete abandonment of everything that had given meaning to German life before the war. Perhaps it might be possible to preserve the best elements of German heritage while discarding the political ideologies that had led to such catastrophic destruction. The crucifix itself became a focal point for these broader hopes and fears about cultural continuity in the emerging post-war order. As Sergeant Mackenzie's restoration work had gradually revealed the original artistry of the medieval carving, local residents had begun to see in the renewed wooden figure a metaphor for their own community's potential for spiritual and cultural renewal. The fact that American hands had participated in this restoration suggested that recovery need not require the complete rejection of German traditions but might instead involve a collaborative process of preserving what was valuable while discarding what had proven destructive. The practical challenges of the restoration work had also created opportunities for German participants to demonstrate skills and knowledge that commanded American respect, thereby beginning to rebuild their sense of dignity and self-worth after the complete collapse of their political and social systems. Master stonemason Wilhelm Hoffmann, whose family had maintained the cathedral's stonework for 3 generations before the war, found himself working alongside American engineers who possessed superior equipment and technical resources but relied on his knowledge of traditional building techniques and understanding of the original builder's intentions. The Americans have wonderful machines and excellent materials, Hoffmann explained to his teenage apprentice, Klaus Müller, as they worked together to reset a series of damaged gargoyles along the cathedral's north wall. But they understand that some kinds of knowledge cannot be learned from books or schools. They listen when I explain how my grandfather taught me to read the intentions of stones, to understand how medieval craftsmen thought about weight and balance and the distribution of forces through these walls. They respect skills that have been passed down through generations of working with our hands. This mutual respect for complementary forms of expertise created a foundation for cooperation that transcended the formal hierarchies of military occupation. American soldiers might possess superior firepower and logistical resources, but they recognized their dependence on local knowledge and traditional skills for accomplishing restoration work that could not be achieved through brute force or technological superiority alone. German craftsmen might lack political power or economic resources, but they retained valuable expertise that American collaborators needed and appreciated. The daily rhythms of the restoration project gradually created informal relationships that challenged the official policies designed to maintain strict separation between occupying forces and civilian populations. Sergeant Mackenzie found himself regularly sharing meals with the Hoffmann family, learning basic German vocabulary, and listening to stories about life in Würzburg before the war that complicated his understanding of how ordinary Germans had experienced the Nazi period. Private Kowalski began teaching English to Klaus Müller in exchange for lessons in traditional woodcarving techniques that connected him to his own Polish heritage in unexpected ways. These personal relationships inevitably raised difficult questions about collective responsibility for the war's atrocities and the appropriate balance between justice and reconciliation in the post-war settlement. American soldiers who had seen the horrors of concentration camps struggled to reconcile their knowledge of systematic genocide with their growing appreciation for the individuals they encountered in daily restoration work. German civilians who had lost family members to Allied bombing or Soviet advance forces found themselves working alongside representatives of the nations that had destroyed their world while simultaneously offering them hope for rebuilding it. Father Weber addressed these moral complexities directly in his Christmas Eve sermon of 1945, delivered in the partially restored cathedral to a congregation that included both German parishioners and American soldiers who had requested permission to attend. "We gather tonight in a sacred space that has been destroyed and is being reborn through the cooperation of former enemies," he told the mixed assembly. This rebuilding teaches us that redemption is always possible when people of good faith are willing to work together, but it does not erase the terrible costs of the hatred and pride that brought us to destruction. We must remember both the possibility of renewal and the price of forgetting our common humanity. The chaplain Murphy, who had worked with Weber to plan the service as an expression of shared Christian commitment that transcended national boundaries, reflected in his own remarks on the theological significance of rebuilding sacred spaces in the aftermath of total war. "Christ himself was a rebuilder," Murphy reminded the congregation, "calling us to love our enemies and to seek reconciliation even with those who have injured us most deeply." The restoration of this cathedral represents more than the repair of damaged stones. It embodies our faith that God's love is stronger than human hatred and that grace can triumph over the worst impulses of fallen humanity. The emotional response to this Christmas Eve service confirmed the transformation that the Restoration Project had accomplished in the relationships between American soldiers and German civilians. Many participants on both sides reported that the experience of worshiping together in a sanctuary they had jointly rebuilt represented a spiritual healing that extended far beyond the physical repair of damaged architecture. The cathedral had become a symbol not just of German cultural heritage or American generosity, but of the human capacity for transcending the divisions created by political conflict and ideological manipulation. As 1946 began and the American occupation settled into longer-term patterns of military governance and democratic reconstruction, the Würzburg Cathedral project served as a model for similar initiatives throughout the American zone. Military commanders who had initially been skeptical about the allocation of resources and personnel to cultural restoration projects began to recognize their value for both maintaining civilian morale and demonstrating American commitment to building a democratic Germany that could preserve its best traditions while abandoning its worst impulses. The success of these church restoration efforts contributed to broader American policies that emphasized cultural exchange and educational cooperation as essential elements of denazification and democratization. Rather than simply attempting to impose American values through administrative decree or economic pressure, occupation authorities began to explore how democratic principles might take root in German soil by building upon existing traditions that were compatible with freedom and human dignity. The wooden crucifix that had served as the focal point for the original restoration project continued to function as a powerful symbol of these possibilities. Visitors to the cathedral, including senior American officials and German political leaders working to establish democratic institutions, often commented on the remarkable story of its restoration and the broader lesson it represented about the potential for former enemies to find common ground in shared values and mutual respect. By the spring of 1946, Sergeant Mackenzie had been promoted to staff sergeant and transferred to occupation duty in Frankfurt, but he maintained correspondence with the Hoffman family and continued to follow the progress of the cathedral restoration through letters and occasional visits. His replacement, Sergeant Robert Anderson from rural Montana, brought different skills and perspectives to the project but maintained the same commitment to completing the work in ways that honored both American capabilities and German traditions. The continuity of American commitment to the restoration project, even as individual personnel rotated through their assignments, demonstrated to German participants that the cooperation they had experienced was not dependent on the personal qualities of particular soldiers but reflected deeper characteristics of democratic societies and their approach to international relations. American institutions, they discovered, could maintain consistent policies and commitments even as leadership changed, suggesting a stability and reliability that contrasted sharply with the chaotic arbitrariness they had experienced under Nazi rule. This institutional continuity became particularly important as the restoration project evolved from emergency repairs to more ambitious plans for complete reconstruction of the cathedral's original Gothic architecture. American military engineers, working with German architects and craftsmen, developed detailed plans that would restore not only the structural integrity of the building, but also its historical appearance and artistic grandeur. The project would require several more years to complete, but it represented a commitment to cultural preservation that extended far beyond immediate military or political necessity. The financial resources for this expanded restoration came from an unexpected source. American soldiers throughout the occupation zone who had heard about the Würzburg project and volunteered contributions from their personal funds to support similar efforts in their own areas of responsibility. These grassroots donations, collected through informal networks and unit newspapers, demonstrated that the cultural sensitivity displayed in Würzburg reflected broader attitudes among American forces rather than isolated acts of individual generosity. Private donations were supplemented by official military, construction funds, and eventually by resources from the emerging Marshall Plan that would channel massive American economic assistance toward European reconstruction. The cathedral restoration became one of thousands of projects supported by this unprecedented program of international aid, but it retained special symbolic significance as one of the first examples of American willingness to help former enemies rebuild not just their economic infrastructure but also their cultural and spiritual heritage. As the restoration work progressed through 1946 and 1947, the cathedral began to attract attention from scholars and artists interested in documenting both the technical challenges of rebuilding medieval architecture and the social dynamics of international cooperation. In the aftermath of total war, American universities sent graduate students to study the project as an example of cultural diplomacy in action, while German researchers examined how traditional craftsmanship techniques could be integrated with modern construction methods and materials. The crucifix, now fully restored to its original condition and permanently installed above the reconstructed main altar, continued to serve as a focal point for reflection on the broader meaning of the cathedral project. Its carved wooden features, revealed through careful cleaning and repair, showed an artistic sophistication that challenged American assumptions about medieval European culture, while its Christian symbolism provided a bridge between German spiritual traditions and American religious heritage that had made cooperation possible. Father Weber, now in his 70s, but still actively serving the growing congregation that gathered in the restored cathedral, often used the crucifix as a text for sermons about forgiveness, reconciliation, and the possibility of finding hope in the midst of devastation. This figure of our Lord, he would tell worshippers, has witnessed 7 centuries of human joys and sorrows, wars and peace, hatred and love. It survived the bombing that destroyed everything around it, and it has been restored through the cooperation of people who were taught to be enemies. It reminds us that God's love is stronger than human hatred and that redemption is always possible for those who seek it. With sincere hearts, the American soldiers who continued to participate in the restoration work, now including personnel from multiple units, as the project expanded beyond the capabilities of any single military organization, found in the cathedral a source of meaning that transcended their official duties as occupation forces. Many wrote home about the spiritual significance they discovered in contributing to the reconstruction of sacred space, describing how the work connected them to traditions of craftsmanship and devotion that provided perspective on their own country's rapid development and technological progress. Corporal Michael Sullivan, a machinist from Detroit who joined the project in late 1946, wrote to his parents that working on the cathedral had taught him something about what people can accomplish when they take the time to do things right, when they build for the ages instead of just for immediate profit. These medieval guys didn't have our machines or our speed, but they created something that lasted 700 years and would have lasted 700 more if we hadn't bombed it. Maybe we Americans could learn something from taking our time and thinking about what we want to leave behind for our grandchildren. This reflection on the relationship between American efficiency and European permanence became a recurring theme in the correspondence and diary entries of soldiers involved in the restoration project. Many had grown up in a culture that celebrated innovation, speed, and material progress, but their exposure to medieval craftsmanship and the patient work required to restore damaged stonework gave them new appreciation for values that their society sometimes overlooked in its rush toward modernization. The German participants in the project, meanwhile, found themselves reconsidering their own assumptions about American culture and the possibilities for preserving European traditions within a democratic framework. Master craftsman Wilhelm Hofmann, whose initial skepticism about American intentions had gradually given way to genuine respect and friendship, began to see in the restoration project a model for how Germany might rebuild itself by combining the best elements of its cultural heritage with the political and economic freedoms offered by democratic institutions. The Americans have shown us that democracy does not require the destruction of everything we have valued. Hoffman explained to a gathering of local craftsmen and artists in the spring of 1947. They respect our skills, our traditions, our history, even while they insist that we abandon the political ideas that led us to catastrophe. Perhaps we can build a new Germany that preserves what is beautiful in our past while embracing the freedom and dignity that democracy offers to all people. This vision of cultural continuity within political transformation became increasingly important as German civil society began to reorganize itself under American oversight and with American support. The Cathedral Restoration Project served as a practical example of how cooperation between Germans and Americans could produce results that neither could achieve alone, suggesting possibilities for broader partnerships in economic reconstruction, educational reform, and the development of democratic institutions. The success of the Würzburg Cathedral project influenced American occupation policy in subtle but significant ways, demonstrating that cultural sensitivity and respect for local traditions could be more effective than heavy-handed attempts to impose American values through administrative decree or economic pressure. Military commanders and civilian administrators began to recognize that winning German cooperation for democratic reconstruction required not just material incentives but also assurance that Germans would be able to maintain their cultural identity within the new political order. This understanding proved crucial as American occupation authorities faced the challenge of implementing denazification programs that would eliminate Nazi influence from German society without destroying the cultural foundations upon which a democratic Germany would need to be built. The cathedral restoration model suggested that it might be possible to separate harmful political ideologies from valuable cultural traditions, preserving what was genuinely worthy in German heritage while discarding what had contributed to war and genocide. The wooden crucifix that had catalyzed this entire process of mutual discovery and cooperation remained a powerful symbol of these possibilities throughout the final phases of the restoration project. When the cathedral was officially rededicated in a ceremony attended by both German church leaders and American occupation officials in June 1947, the restored crucifix served as the focal point for reflections on what had been accomplished and what it might represent for the future of German-American relations. Bishop Michael Buchberger, who had traveled from Regensburg to preside over the rededication ceremony, used his homily to place the restoration project within the broader context of European recovery and the search for lasting peace. This cathedral stands again as a testament to the power of faith and cooperation to overcome even the most terrible destruction, he told the assembled congregation of Germans and Americans. But more than that, it represents a new beginning in the relationship between our peoples, a recognition that former enemies can become partners in building a better world based on mutual respect and shared commitment to human dignity. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor of Germany, responded with remarks that emphasized the restoration project's significance as a symbol of American intentions in occupied Europe. The United States did not come to Germany to destroy your culture or erase your history, Clay declared. We came to defeat a political system that had brought suffering to millions of people, including the German people themselves. This cathedral, rebuilt through the cooperation of American soldiers and German craftsmen, represents our commitment to helping you build a new Germany that can preserve what is best in your traditions while embracing the democratic values that will ensure peace and prosperity for future generations. The emotional impact of these words was evident in the tears that many German participants shed during the ceremony, not from sorrow or defeat, but from relief and gratitude at discovering that their conquerors possessed both the power and the wisdom to distinguish between political systems they needed to eliminate and cultural traditions they could help preserve and strengthen. The restoration of their cathedral had become a symbol of hope that Germany itself might be restored to its rightful place in the community of civilized nations. As the ceremony concluded and the congregation slowly dispersed from the restored cathedral, many participants lingered to examine the craftsmanship that had gone into the reconstruction work. The wooden crucifix, now permanently installed above the main altar, drew particular attention from visitors who wanted to understand how medieval artistry and modern restoration techniques had been combined to produce such remarkable results. The figure of Christ, carved 7 centuries earlier by an unknown artist and restored through the collaboration of former enemies, seemed to embody the possibility that even the most bitter divisions could be healed through patience, skill, and mutual respect. The long-term impact of the Würzburg Cathedral restoration extended far beyond the immediate benefits for local morale and German-American relations. The project had demonstrated that cultural diplomacy could be an effective complement to political and economic programs in building stable democratic institutions and fostering international cooperation. American policymakers studying the results began to incorporate similar approaches into the broader Marshall Plan and other post-war reconstruction efforts, recognizing that successful democratization required attention to cultural and spiritual dimensions as well as material needs. The restoration also influenced German thinking about the relationship between national identity and democratic governance, providing concrete evidence that democracy need not require the abandonment of cultural traditions but could actually provide better protection for religious freedom and artistic expression than authoritarian alternatives. German intellectuals and political leaders struggling to develop a new democratic constitution drew upon the cathedral experience as an example of how American-style separation of church and state might actually strengthen rather than weaken religious institutions. In the years that followed, the restored Cathedral of St. Kilian became a pilgrimage destination for visitors interested in understanding how former enemies had learned to work together in rebuilding what war had destroyed. The wooden crucifix continued to serve as a focal point for reflection on themes of destruction and restoration, hatred and reconciliation, division and unity that had defined the cathedral project and its broader significance for post-war European reconstruction. Veterans of the restoration project, both German and American, maintained contact with each other through correspondence and occasional reunions, creating lasting personal relationships that transcended the political circumstances that had originally brought them together. These friendships provided a human foundation for the broader alliance between West Germany and the United States that would become crucial for European security and prosperity during the Cold War era. The cathedral itself, fully restored to its original Gothic grandeur by 1950, stood as a permanent monument to the possibility that even the most destructive conflicts could give way to creative cooperation when people of good faith were willing to recognize their common humanity and shared commitment to transcendent values. Its soaring spires, rebuilt stone by stone through German craftsmanship and American support, reached toward the same heaven that had inspired the original medieval builders and continued to offer hope for peace and reconciliation to all who entered its sacred space. In the end, The restoration of St. Kilian Cathedral represented more than the repair of war damage or even the successful implementation of cultural diplomacy. It embodied a profound truth about human nature and the possibilities for redemption that exist even in the darkest circumstances of history. The wooden crucifix that had survived bombing, been restored through international cooperation, and continued to inspire worship and reflection, stood as a testament to the enduring power of faith, hope, and love to overcome hatred, fear, and despair. The tears that German civilians had shed as they watched American soldiers help rebuild their bombed church were tears of recognition that their enemies possessed the capacity for mercy and generosity that propaganda had denied, recognition that their own cultural and spiritual heritage could survive political catastrophe, and recognition that the future might hold possibilities for cooperation and mutual understanding that seemed impossible during the darkest days of total war. In those tears lay the seeds of a new relationship between former enemies, a relationship based not on conquest and submission, but on mutual respect and shared commitment to building a better world for future generations.